All right, today we're going to be covering what damage these anti-gun steps that we've seen lately actually have. And you guys all know the culprits. First one, boom, Virginia does a state tax on silencers for $500. Second one, New York bans 3D printing firearms in their state. And then after we're done with all that and kind of going over what's going on and what kind of real damage they're actually going to cause, we're going to talk about the NFA as a whole, where we're at and what's going on. What's the likely future of the NFA and how things are looking. One of the biggest things I need you to remember before we move on is if you'd like to help support the channel directly, the best way to do that is shop at OnlyTechFans at Shopify.com. As everybody knows, I'm permanently banned from YouTube monetization, so that's how I pay the bills, and I appreciate everyone that shopped there. Thank you. Every dollar there goes directly into supporting this channel. Anyways, let's get into it. So, let's start off with the Virginia $500 tax stamp on silencers. This is going to stick. I hate to say it, but yeah. Remember, we've been trying to get silencers off of the NFA since 1934, and because it's such a prize cow, and the politicians and Supreme Court and everybody just keeps backing it up and adding on more double downs and more levels of protection, what are we going to sue for? Yeah, don't get me wrong, we're going to sue. There ain't no doubt in my mind that immediately the GOA, NRA, or whatever gun group is going to sue and be like, hey, this is directly put there to try to stop people from buying a firearms attachment. And as in Heller, they said that anything related to the firearms or anything like that is protected under the Second Amendment. Or maybe it wasn't Heller. The point is the whole taser thing, because they were trying to make the case that tasers were not an arm, therefore they're not protected by the Second Amendment, therefore they could be regulated and restricted. Well, in that particular case, which I believe was Heller, I don't remember for sure, sorry about that, yeah, they were like, no. If it's related to a firearm or self-defense, it's protected by the Second Amendment.
This is Caetano versus Massachusetts, 2016. It is a significant Second Amendment case because it clarified that the right to bear arms isn't just limited to weapons that existed in the 1700s. It also includes modern technology like tasers and stun guns. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court initially upheld her conviction, using three main arguments that the U.S. Supreme Court eventually dismantled. 1. Not in common use at the time of the founding. 2. Dangerous and unusual. 3. Not used in the military. The Supreme Court's ruling. In a brief, unanimous per curiam, unsigned opinion, the U.S. Supreme Court vacated Caetano's conviction. They relied heavily on their earlier landmark decision, District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008, stating, "The Second Amendment extends prima facie to all instruments that constitute bearable arms, even those that were not in existence at the time of the founding."
And then you also seen that with Texas, when they were like, hey, we're going to have it so any silencer that doesn't leave the state of Texas and manufactured in the state of Texas is not regulated by the NFA, because the NFA is a federal agency and that can only handle state-to-state transactions. It cannot handle things inside the state. And that's one of the arguments the government's been making the whole time, is that if you have a gun, at some point, whether it's the gun or the ammunition, it's going to come from a different state, it's going to cross state lines, and therefore it's regulated by the federal government. Yeah. Bunch of cases went up and been like, hey, this gun was made in the state and never left the state. The ammunition was made in the state, never left the state, but still, the federal court system just keeps backing up the NFA. So will they shut down this 500 tax? Not likely, not at least in the short term. So short term, we're looking at the tax absolutely stays in place. And that sucks for Virginians because now they're subject to a $500 state tax for silencers. Long term, what are we looking at here? So one of two options is basically going to happen long term. One, the tax stays in place and silencers get the absolute living shit tax out of them in all anti-gun states. Probably a couple of pro-gun states might throw on a state tax as well, because they'll be like, oh, we're missing all this revenue. That's the bad side. That's, all right, so we sue them, it goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's like, no, the states absolutely have the right to tax goods coming in, and they are absolutely not protected by the Second Amendment. That's worst case scenario. And basically, then if you're going to want an NFA item, you're going to have to move to a state that doesn't tax the crap out of it, because you think it's going to stay at $500? Hell no, it's not. It's going to fly way up. It's going to probably be thousands of dollars in some state. As a matter of fact, there was one even congressman, Guns and Gadgets just covered this. He was saying something about like a $4,000 tax he wanted to put back on silencers. Yeah, that bill ain't going to go anywhere, but it tips their hand. We know exactly what they're trying to do. Like, well, hey, if they can make the tax zero, we can make the tax $1 million. and it'll go from there. Now, Supreme Court could be like, it's got to be a reasonable amount. $500, well, that's still kind of the price of a silencer, so, they could consider that reasonable, but if this was $5,000 and the silencer's $100, it's kind of hard to justify that and not be like, hey, that's a restriction on the Second Amendment. But, again, if they say that silencers aren't covered by the Second Amendment, it doesn't matter. The states can just tax the hell out of it, make it so you can't buy one unless you're Donald Trump. Now, the other option is, this goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's like, totally shift. One, you can't tax a right, and two, that tax is specifically put there to stop people from buying it. Well, that's a restriction on the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment's a right, so therefore you can't have that tax, in which case, bam, it'll ultimately lead to silencers coming off the NFA. That's what all that will circle around to if this goes favorable. So we'll have to see how it plays out. Obviously, we probably won't have a resolution of this for 10 years? So we're looking at 2035 before we know what's going on with that, because that's about how long it takes to drag through the federal court system, because the federal court system is basically quicksand. Unless you're Tate, where they're just like deny, 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 and then all of a sudden you're at SCOTUS right away, it's going to take years for that to move through the court system. Because first, what they'll probably do is they'll sue on a state level. So then it's got to go through the state levels, then it'll hit the state Supreme Court, and if they still don't shut it down, well, now it'll switch to a federal level, and then it'll have to climb up to the 3-judge panel, and then the 6-judge panel, and then you got to wait for SCOTUS to approve it, and they'll probably deny the first, 3 or 4 attempts, because they'll be looking for a case where all the facts are already found, and all the cases already argued out, so they just have to rubber stamp it with a decision. Kind of like what they did with bump stocks. I think that went to the Supreme Court 6 times. They kept deny, 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 deny. Finally, somebody had a case put together, presented in a way they wanted to rule on it, because remember, they want to rule in a specific way. They're like, all right, so this is what we think. So in order for us to rule on this case, it's got to fall within this box. We don't want to touch this issue, this issue, this issue. We need somebody to bring specifically up this issue, and that's what we're going to rule on. So that could happen. Like I said, it could be 10 years before we ever see anything out of there. Moving on to the next thing, that is, wha-bam! New York bans 3D printed firearms.
Proposing the first in the nation law requiring all 3D printers sold in the state of New York to include software that blocks the printer from creating a gun. It's just common sense.
So Kathy Hochul, whatever the hell her name is, nobody cares, everyone hates her anyway. She put this bill together, and it basically hits on 2 things. One, in order for a 3D printer to be sold in New York, it's got to have firmware in it that will detect the firearms part, which absolutely exists. Otherwise, it can't be sold in New York. 2, the files themselves are now going to be considered firearms, and you'll go to prison for them. So how's that realistically going to affect things? Well, let's break it into 2 pieces. Let's talk about the firmware on the 3D printer. Yes, 100%. You can change the firmware. You can use a VPN and make it look so like your 3D printer is being operated in Hawaii. Like, you can do that. You can definitely still print firearms. That will not stop it. And that's not the problem. And they know that. You got to remember, this is a chess piece move. The first piece was moved in 2021 when they made it really easy to sue for patent rights. Now the next piece is moving with this firmware thing, because they're not just going to make New York compliant 3D printers. So a huge part of America lives in New York. So what they're going to do is they're just going to design all 3D printers with this firmware. And they'll just be sold, and it'll be turned on and off depending on where you live. Basically, your VPN will determine whether or not your 3D printer is allowed to print firearms. And that's the whole point. It isn't to try to stop New Yorkers from printing firearms, because they 100% totally can. There's a million workarounds for this. But now all 3D printers that are going to be made from this point on will already have firmware built in it. So later, when they move their queen out, boom! Now they can shut down all firearms manufactured on all 3D printers by the flip of a switch. And by the time they do that, which will be 10 years, maybe 15 years down the road, we'll have long forgotten about this, and all the 3D printers will have it in there, and then the old ones will be all obsolete and gone. There'll just be a couple of basically Apple Ones laying around. But the majority part of people have modern 3D printers, because they'll find other ways to make you want to upgrade, because that's the whole point. So then, boom, they'll flip the switch, and across the board, people overnight will no longer be able to print firearms or firearms parts. Again, this is just the pawn moving forward on that particular chess piece, on that particular chessboard. The Queen hasn't moved out yet. The point isn't New York. The point is to make manufacturers of 3D printers include this into the firmware until all of them have it. So when the commies finally make their move, they can just flip a switch and shut them all off overnight. There'll still be some out there again, and there'll still be workarounds again, but that's not the point. The point is the move. You just have to identify the move and understand what direction they're going. The next one, making the actual files themselves a firearm. Yeah, again, you can still work this around with VPNs and that, but besides yourself, how many other people do you know with illegal machine guns? I bet you it's less than 5. I bet you it's probably closer to maybe 1 or 0. If you have illegal firearms, like illegal machine guns, you're probably one of the only people you know who does. And it's not just because people don't tell us, because the law's in place and it scares people. Why would you want to break the law? Do you really want to wind up in federal prison? And they most certainly will send you to federal prison. They sent me to federal prison over a drawing on a piece of metal. You don't think that 1s and 0s that can actually make a firearm by the push of a button is how to word it, is harder to prosecute than an actual drawing? Like, they're going to be like, all right, here's a 3D printer, and it took us 4 hours. It's probably less, but we'll say 4 hours to print out this Glock lower receiver. That definitely counts as easy. They'll call it readily convertible. They will send you to prison. You may win your appeal later, or the law may change later, but that doesn't change the fact that today in New York, when this law kicks in, and probably in other states, if you are caught with a file, the file itself is contraband, and you will go to prison. And what they'll do is the feds will, or in this case the state, will have an open source website, and they'll have a contraband file on there, and as soon as you download the contraband files, that gives them probable cause to hack your computer, and they data mine the whole thing. And if you have those files, they'll know. Believe me, I sat time with a whole bunch of people in prison. It happened because of CP, not firearms files, but the same exact thing. They went on to like Napster or something like that. They downloaded a movie because that's pirating a movie, and the feds put that movie on there. It also had a worm attached to it, and boom, it data mined their whole computer, and several of them got caught by that. I'm telling you, it happens. You'll be on your own open source website that you always go to, the trusted website, and you won't know it, but that particular file you download will be contraband in some way. I don't know how, but some way. And as soon as you download that, now that probable cause to raid your entire computer. And if you have firearm files on there, bam, you're hit. So that's the whole point of that. It's not that she can actually stop you. It's that they make the files themselves illegal. And then the potential punishment of it will stop people all by itself, kind of like the 1986 machine gun ban. Yeah. Like literally a couple of hand tools and you have a machine gun. How come everybody doesn't have a machine gun? Because it's against the law. Do you think people are going to want to transfer you a file when transferring that file is the same thing as transferring an unregistered firearm without a 4473? Absolutely not. There'll still be the fringe group out there that does it, but mainstream, it'll ultimately kill it. So that's something you have to be aware of too. Now that we talked about all the anti-gun stuff, where are we at with the NFA? Well, in my opinion, the NFA is going to fall. Not for like explosives and that, but for firearms. And hear me out and listen to why. So a couple of different things. You used to have anti-gun, which is primarily Democrat, and then pro-gun, which is primarily Republican. So it's always been left and right. They've always been split on that issue. We're going to take another issue so it makes sense to you. We're going to talk about marijuana. So marijuana was almost always pro-Democrat, and then Republican was always anti. Well, as the Republicans slowly converted over, all of a sudden it becomes an issue that both sides of the aisles agree with, that, hey, marijuana shouldn't be illegal, and we're taking steps to make it not illegal anymore. We're seeing the same thing with firearms. There was 2 major events. Number 1 was the lockdowns and riots. Because that happened in so many different states, it answered the question for a lot of people, why do you need a firearm? Well, literally, the cops can't even come to you. The streets are blocked off. That's why they need a firearm, and now a whole bunch of those people that were primarily anti-gun, and I worked at a gun shop this time, and they came like locusts, and you've seen it. They've never bought a gun before, and they've always been anti-gun. Now they're wanting to buy a firearm. The second event was now the news pushing that ICE is this evil secret police that Donald Trump sent out there, and he's a Nazi, and this is the Nazi thugs. They're basically doing what happened in 1939 to the Jews to American citizens right now. Now it went from those people that lived in gated communities that were like, oh, yeah, well, you know what? The riots and protests are way down there. I don't have to worry about it. Now this affects people that even live in gated communities because they're buying into this hook, line, and sinker. They're like, yeah, there's secret police running around there. They're shooting people in their SUVs. They're killing people on the left and taking little babies and sending them to Guatemala and Honduras and these prisons and just locking people up. That message resonated. Actually, Guns and Gear on his Instagram, go check it out. He's posting all these leftist videos being like, hey, it's time to strap up. And yeah, it's convincing people, a lot of people. They don't understand the damage they're causing to their cause. They are doing the hard work for us. Yeah, it sucks that they're freaking all these people out and that, but now they finally have a reason. Why do I need a firearm? Before they could never answer that. They're like, well, if somebody breaks into my house, I'll just give them whatever they want and I'll call the police. Or if somebody wants to mug me, I'll just bow down and be like, hey, here, take everything. It's all insured anyways. Who really cares? Well, insurance doesn't stop you from these secret police or these riots. They flipped the script. Now instead of the Democrats primarily being anti-gun, they're creeping over and on a massive scale going pro-gun. So now it's coming to both sides of the aisle are being pro-gun. We've seen that in the big, beautiful bill. They pushed silencers to come off of the tax to come off of it. They wanted to take it off the registry, but that didn't happen. I guess Pam Bondi was pushing really hard to keep it on the registry. So we didn't get it off the registry, but we did get the tax to zero. That in itself shows you. And now all of a sudden we have, all right, when they made felons that you couldn't have firearms, you can't do that because that violates the Second Amendment because that restricts firearms. So they had to have an avenue so you could reapply for firearms, but they didn't want to give anyone their firearms back, so they made that avenue and then they just defunded it. Well, it's refunded again. Like I said, you could see the political shift. It's out there. It really is. I don't know how long it's going to take, but yeah, small arms as a whole, silencers, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, PDWs, full autos, all that is going to come off of the NFA. Too many people are going pro-gun for it not to. There was a huge shift after Obama. Like they said, they freaked out like 99% of Americans, and a huge percent of that was anti-gun and now have a reason why I need firearms. So we'll have to see how it plays out because there's other problems with the NFA too. Like, you can't tax a right. And how can you call something a tax that you refuse to collect? And Congress didn't really even give them the proper taxing powers to do it anyway. And you can only tax from the federal government things that cross state lines. A lot of these items don't. There's so many problems. Eventually, the Supreme Court's going to pick up one of those cases and be like, yeah, the NFA is unconstitutional. We'll keep it for explosives or something like that. They'll do a little carve out. But for small arms, it'll eventually come off. I mean, it's looking like an AR-15 is ultimately going to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court already said in Illinois that why would we regulate a firearm in common use? The AR-15 is the most owned firearm in America. How can you put a regulation on it? Because it's definitely protected by the Second Amendment. After that happens, after that goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court officially says that, now the question comes, what AR-15s? Are we talking about pink AR-15s, black AR-15s, short AR-15s, long AR-15s? What's the difference between a full auto AR-15 and a semi-automatic AR-15? So because AR-15s are protected by the Second Amendment, which ones? And eventually they're going to have to say, well, all AR-15s are protected by the Second Amendment, and that covers full auto AR-15s. That's what's going to happen. Anyways, I better wrap this up because I've been going on for a while here. If you guys like to help support the channel and you don't want to do only tech fans at Shopify.com, the easiest way to do that is go down in the description, click on my affiliate link to Amazon. Even if you don't buy what that particular link is for, just clicking on it and doing the Amazon shopping you were already going to do anyway. I get a little kickback for it because you came there off my channel. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.